Welcome to the Well Woman Movement Bible Study. My name is Kalanda Douglas, and we are continuing our Women in the Bible series. And for this month, we are talking about the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 37, as well as there's mention of her in 2 Kings 8, verses 1 through 6. So we are at the point in the story where Elijah has passed. He has given his mantle to Elisha. The king of Israel now is Jehoram. King Ahab has died. And during this time, the Bible says that King Jehoram isn't as bad as his parents were as leaders of Israel, but he still did evil in the sight of the Lord. So there's a certain pagan statue that he got rid of that his father erected, but then he still allowed there to be pagan worship. So this is a time where pagans were able to worship freely, and equally Elisha was able to also preach and prophesy as well. So in 2 Kings chapter 4, we are going to start in verse 8. The Bible talks about how he is going to and fro. He's going traveling, and he is talking about the gospel. And so he goes frequently to a town called Shunem. And Shunem is likely a place where there are also pagans who exist, and there are also believers who exist there as well. So he's going to and from this town, and he goes so often that there's a woman, and the Bible refers to her as Shunammite woman, doesn't list her name, but he happens to, Elisha visits this place so often, the Shunammite woman notices how often he visits and decides that or perceives that this is a holy man of God. So what she does is she asks her husband, so whenever he passes through, they would allow Elisha to come and eat whenever he's coming through. So eventually she asked her husband to let's just set a place for him. So when he does come and he ends up eating here, he also has a place where he can like lay his head. So that's what he do. That's what she does. And the Bible calls her specifically, mentions that she's a notable woman. And that just insinuates that she was either influential, perhaps she was wealthy, or that she was an older woman. And so that's really the only characteristic that we have concerning her. So they made a place in their home for her, for Elisha, upstairs in their home. And the Bible says there was a bed, a table, a chair, and a lampstand. And when Elisha, as he did, came through Shunem, and he stayed with them, in return for their hospitality, he says, "What can I do for you?" And the woman replies, like, I dwell among my people. Like, I'm not in a hostile environment. I live with people who I live peaceably here. So she's like, I don't have any requests. I'm content. Essentially is what she's saying. So Elisha talks to his servant Gehazi, and it says, is talking about it, and Gehazi knows what the woman wants. And he says to Elisha, they don't have children. Her husband is old, and they don't have any children. So that gives Elisha an opportunity to provide her with something in response for her hospitality. So she tells him, and we are in verse 15, and Elisha tells his servant Gehazi to call her. And he says, Elisha says, about this time next year, you're going to embrace a son. And so because she is been without child for so long, and we know in biblical context, we understand that barrenness was considered to some people to be a curse from God. That there was, in their minds, a reason why a person could not have children, and it likely had to do with like God not looking favorably upon you. So the woman says, no, basically, don't tease me. I've been without a child for so long. Don't tease me, man of God. Please don't lie to me that I am going to, have a child. But the Bible says in verse 17 that the woman conceived, and she bore a son exactly during the time when Elisha said that she would. So the child grew, and then one day the child came out to the fields where his father was, and he complained about his head. And so the father told the servants to take him to his mother. And so they took the child to the Shunammite woman, his mom, and she sat him on her lap for some time, and then he died sitting in her lap. So it's important to note that while the Shunammite woman was blessing Elisha with material things, in response or in gratitude for her hospitality, he blessed her with something beyond material things. He blessed her with a prophetic word that she was going to have a child. She has a child, and now the child has just died on her lap. So the woman decides that she's going to take the child upstairs, and she lays the child on the bed that in the room that they have made for Elisha. She laid the child on his bed and closed the door. And it seems as if she didn't mention the child's death to anybody, because what she does immediately after is goes to her husband and say, "Hey, I need to go see Elisha." And her husband is asking, like, why? It's not like a special holiday. It's not the Sabbath. It's not a new moon. We're not having a festival that requires us to have, you'd have to see the man of God. Like, why do you need to go? And so he gives her permission to go, and she tells her servant who is driving the donkey, don't slow down, basically, unless I tell you to slow down. So it seems that the Shunammite woman, because of her previous experience with Elisha, like, this is the man who spoke that I was going to have a son, and now my child has died. Because of her previous experience with Elisha, led her to believe that she can likely expect another miracle if she were to go to him. It's also interesting that as a mom, her immediate response was not burial. Her immediate thought was that there must gonna be a miracle. There must gonna be some type of resurrection that's going to happen. Because this can't be the same child who I never even had, or the same child that I didn't even know was a possibility to have is now died. Like, God must gonna do something. So it's interesting that she did not prepare for a burial, but she prepared for a resurrection by just laying the child on the bed. Now you have to consider in your in your humanity, into your intellectual mind. The Bible says she traveled about 20 miles. So this child is dead. And she goes to where Elijah is. I don't know how she knows where he is, but Elisha sees her from afar off, and he tells his servant, like, "Hey, that's the Shunammite woman. Like, go out to meet her and ask her, is everything okay? Like, is everything okay with you, with your child, with your husband?" And so the servant meets the woman, and he asks her, basically, is everything okay? And the Bible says in verse 26, it is well. But as we keep reading, we understand that she didn't want to deal with the servant. She wanted to talk to Elisha. So she kept going towards Elisha. And the Bible says that she reached out, and whatever physical placement that they were in, she reached out and grabbed Elisha's heel. And Elisha's servant, Gehazi, started to push her off. And then Elisha recognized like her um discontentment. He recognized that something else was going on here in order for her to behave like this. So he says to his servant, "Leave her alone. Her soul is in deep distress." And he says, "And the Lord hasn't shown me like what's the cause of her distress. He's hidden it from me. He has not told me." And so this is the part I like. In verse 28, she says to Elisha, "Did I ask you for a son?" It's like, you asked me what you could do for me, and I told you I was fine. But you had to go open up your mouth and speak a word to me that I was going to bear a son. I did, and now look what has happened essentially. Did I ask for a son? She said, "Did I not tell you don't deceive me?" Because unless this thing was going to be real, unless it was going to come to pass, unless it was going to be something that I was going to be able to hold on to, that was going to bless me, I didn't even want to get my hopes up. Did I tell you not to deceive me? And so now here, the child that you promised me came, but now the child is not even a man yet. which we know because he's able to sit. She was able to sit the child on her lap, and now he's died. I kind of feel like you play with my emotions, and I ask you not to deceive me. Essentially, it's essentially what she's saying. So Elisha is recognizes what's happened. I think it's interesting that in that moment, he is more surprised that God didn't tell him about what was happening, and less surprised about the fact that God would speak to him at all. And I think that's something that we need to learn from Elisha in this moment, is that he was so used to being in communion or in communication with the Lord that it surprised him that the Lord had not given him the heads up, because this is the same God who told him to speak this word to this woman that she was going to have a baby. And he mentions that the Lord hid it from me. So his expectation of God is that you always speak. You always give me what to say, how to say it. So he tells Gehazi, okay, this is what you do. Get yourself ready. Take my staff in your hand and be on your way. While you're traveling, if anybody tries to talk to you, if anybody tries to greet you, have a conversation with you, don't answer them. Don't greet anybody. I need you to make haste and go see about this child. And he says, and when you get there, lay the staff on the child's face. So the mother of the child says, the Shunammite woman says, okay, that's all good. I'm not going to get Gehazi. I'm staying right here with you, Elijah, because she still has experience, like she has a previous experience with Elisha. So that is where her expectation is. Like, I don't really know Gehazi, but I've seen you work. I know what you can do. So she's like, Gehazi basically can go ahead and do his thing, but I'm staying with you. So that kind of let Elijah know, like, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to go too, because she's like, Gehazi is fine, if you want to see him, but I still expect you to come along too. So the Bible says, so Elisha got up to follow her. In verse 31, it says, Gehazi, the servant, went ahead of them and went to their house, and he laid the staff on the face of the child, and there was neither voice nor hearing. And so nothing happened. So he was far long enough, and I don't know what pace that Elisha and the Shunammite woman were traveling at, but he was far long enough where he had the servant was able to make it back to them and meet them and say, like, look, I did exactly what you said and nothing happened. So imagine the Shunammite woman in this moment, like, okay, like, here again, I'm thinking, I told you not to deceive me. Did I ask you for a son? And now you sent your servant ahead to do something, and he couldn't even get it done. So the servant's like, the child didn't wake up. I did exactly what you said, but the child didn't wake up. So then Elisha makes it to the house, and he closes the door behind him, and he sees the child laying dead on the bed. Now, I don't know how long this has been, how many hours it has been. And the Bible says when he closed the door, he prayed to God. So it seems as if initially Elijah was trying to follow a pattern that he had previously done. This is the same man who told the widow to go and collect vases from other people, clean them out, and then pour your oil. Because he had asked the woman, what does she need? And he said, pour your oil until it's empty. And then she only had a little oil up, and as she poured, like miraculously, she kept filling up vessels. And the Bible says that Elisha told her to sell what she needed to take care of her debt, and then you live off the rest with your sons. So he has this ministry pattern, really, where he doesn't necessarily do the act, but he tries to connect the people or give them the opportunity to work with God and to trust God for themselves. So with the woman, you go get the vessels, pour the oil, and that's her having to work with the Lord and seeing the miracle. Like Elisha didn't participate in pouring the oil. The Bible doesn't say anything about him touching the oil. So essentially, it seemed as if he was trying to do the same thing with Gehazi. I don't have to be there. All I have to do is tell Gehazi what to do, which will allow Gehazi to work directly with the Lord, trust God, for himself to see this miracle happen. But it reveals Gehazi's limitations, right? In this area. And then if you keep reading about Gehazi, the Bible talks about some other character flaws and limitations that he had, which may provide an understanding or an explanation for why he wasn't able to perform this miracle. So Elisha gets to the place. He has the door closed and he's prayed to God. And the Bible says that he laid upon the child. He put his mouth to the child's mouth. He put his eyes on the child's eyes, his hands on the child's hands, and he stretched himself out on the child. And the Bible says, and the child began to feel warm. And so then he returned and walked, like he stood back up, and then he walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on the child again. And the Bible says the child sneezed 7 times and then opened his eyes. So it's important to note that Elisha's success is only dependent on the fact that he prayed to God. Like his mentor, Elijah, which is so interesting, experienced similar success when raising someone's child from the dead when he prayed to the Lord. And so it was, it's like confirmation that it really doesn't matter who the vessel is, that it was Elijah or that it was Elisha. The healing miracle does not lie in the person, but it lies in their obedience to God, and it lies in the power of God. They were just conduits of God's power, because we're looking at 2 different men who essentially performed similar miracles. And so that's a great reminder for us that we don't have to be Elijah or Elisha. All we need is a relationship with the Lord so that we could be a conduit of his power. And so his success was only based on his prayer. And so the Bible says he called for the woman and said, pick up your son. And the Bible says she went, fell at his feet, bowed to the ground in thanks and gratitude. And she took up her baby and she walked out. So we don't see the Shunammite woman again until 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 1. Now consider you've had this I'm not going to say traumatic, but this emotional experience with this man of God. So no doubt, like who he is, his gift, his spiritual calling is like, it's like in your mind, it's solid. Like there's no question about who he is. So in chapter 8, the Bible says that Elijah spoke to the Shunammite woman and told her to arise, go, leave your house and stay wherever you can. He told her that the Lord was calling a famine in the land that she was living in, and that it would be for 7 years. And so the Bible says in chapter 8, verse 2, the woman arose and did according to the saying of the man of God. And she went with her house and she dwelt in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. It didn't say, it seemed as like without haste. There was no question about what he said or what his instructions were. She did exactly what he said because, again, she's had this experience with him. And so the Bible says in verse 3, it came to pass at the end of 7 years, the woman went back to the land of the Philistines, returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went back to the king. So it seems like she went back to Shunem to make an appeal to the king for her land. It's been 7 years. We left because of the famine. Now we're coming back and I want my land back. I want my house back. And so I thought it was interesting that previously when Elisha first wanted to do something in gratitude for the woman's hospitality, one of the things he asked her back in chapter 4 was, do you want me to talk to the king or like the captain of the army on your behalf? And she said no, because she was content. She felt, she dwelt among her people. She didn't really have any needs. But this time, there was a need perhaps for someone to intercede on her behalf to the king. So she was going to make an appeal with the king. And it seems at the same time, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, is also talking to the king and telling the king all of the great things that Elisha has done. And he says that he's telling him what Elijah has done, and he's telling the king that, that that he's restored the dead to life. He's told the person that he basically rose this woman from the dead. He's telling him about like the widow's oil. He's telling the kings about some of the things that Elisha has done. And when the king asks Gehazi, the woman, when the king asked the Shunammite woman about it, she told him, yeah, exactly what Gehazi is saying. Yeah, he did raise my child from the dead. And so the Bible says, and the king appointed a certain officer for her and said, restore all that was hers and all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left the land until now. So essentially the king is saying, give her back her land. And everything all the proceeds that have been made off of her land in her absence in the last 7 years, give all of that back to her as well. So she found favor with the king, and she was rewarded what was owed to her, although she was not there. So here are a few things that I feel like we should learn from the Shunammite woman, because while we could easily walk away from this story and see it from the perspective of Elisha and how, his obedience to God and the miracles he was, the Lord allowed him to perform on behalf of the woman, I think it's even more interesting what the Shunammite woman teaches us. And one of those things is that we need to make sure that we're able to recognize our spiritual resources. Like the Lord has placed people around us, just as we're able to recognize material resources. Like we know when we have like, okay, that's an accountant, that's a realtor, that's a contractor, that's a lawyer over there. Okay, that's a therapist. We're able to recognize material resources or human resources, but we also need to make sure that we're able to recognize spiritual resources. And the fact that the Bible doesn't say what she believed, but she lived in a town where pagan practices were prominent as much as Christian practices, and Jewish practices, because they weren't called Christians then. But whatever she practiced, she recognized that this was a man of God, and she was able to identify him or to see him as a spiritual resource. And so even when I feel like eventually she recognized him as a spiritual resource, but not instantly. Because in the beginning, when he asked her, in gratitude for your hospitality, what can I do for you? That was her opportunity to say, well, I'm so glad you asked. I have been petitioning the Lord about X, Y, and Z. She didn't do that. She said, I'm content. Like I dwell among my people. Like I don't have any needs. And it's not that she didn't want anything, because as we read, Gehazi reveals what she wanted. She wanted a son. So it's not that she didn't want anything, it's that the thing that she desired most, perhaps she thought it was too big to ask for or to even share, thought it was too impossible of a request to be granted. So she never even mentioned it. So she didn't necessarily realize who she was standing before until he said, you're going to have a son next year. And then the promise came to pass, and then she went back to him when the child died. But we need to be able to recognize our spiritual resources before they're revealed. Like we need to be more discerning so that we know them before they have to become like in our face. So when we have the opportunity to petition something, or there's something that they want to do on behalf of God for us, we're able to discern those moments. It's fortunate that Gehazi knew what the woman wanted, because perhaps since she said she didn't want anything, Elisha may have just said, okay, well, we tried, but Gehazi knew exactly what she wanted. So we want to make sure that's the first lesson we learned from the Shunammite woman, is that we need to recognize our spiritual resources. The second thing that we learned from her is that a gift given, then taken away, reveals the root of our faith. So when God gives us a miracle, the Bible says his blessings are without sorrow. And so we believe that as long as sorrow does not exist or it's not experienced with this blessing. But typically what happens is things that God has given to us as gifts, when they begin to look like this might be sorrow, or like it seemed like you're giving me a hard time, we begin to question, was this from you, God, or was this from the enemy? People do this with marriages. They do this with ministries, with businesses, with creative ideas, with houses, with cars. When that thing becomes something perhaps that the Lord takes away from us, or in the instance of Abraham, the Lord wants it back. He's asking for us to sacrifice it, or the marriage gets rocky, or the ministry gets rocky because no one is supporting, no one is participating. Those are the moments that really reveal the root of our faith. Because what we have to understand is that God is always good. So even when he gives us gifts, when he allows us to experience miracles, he does it because he is good. So if he's giving us a gift and then perhaps he takes it away, or he's requiring us to sacrifice it, or there's some hardship in maintaining that miracle, or watching over that miracle, or keeping that miracle, or seeing that miracle develop, because this can even happen with children. But for the woman, it happened like, my child was a gift and now you took it away because the child is dead. What we typically could say to ourselves is that, God, how could you be so callous? How could you be so harsh? How could you be so mean to give me something and then take it back? But the real root of our faith should tell us that God is always good. So if he's given this to me and then he's taking it from me, or he is requiring me to sacrifice it, or I am experiencing tension or hardship with something that I know he gave me as a gift, because I know and understand that he's always good, should also help me to understand that there must be a reason that this is happening, and that there is meaning behind what he allows. And so in the instance of Abraham, for example, the Lord wanted to know, if I ask you of anything, will you put it before me, or will you sacrifice me or submit it to me if I ask you to do that? So there was a reason the Lord asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, not because God is a child murderer, or because God is callous and he only wanted Abraham to be a father for a short period of time, but because he wanted to know it wanted to do a quality test when it came to Abraham's heart. So those are the moments where the real root of our faith is determined. And then finally, the Shunammite woman shows us that it's obedience that opens doors. Whatever the Shunammite, whatever Elisha asked her to do, when it came to being hospitable, I don't know that, while he was there or during that time, how she may have served him, how she may have been a gracious host, or how she may have taken care of him, or what she may have done for him and his servant. But the fact that she was obedient to the Lord, for whatever reason, the Lord prompted her to see this man and say, hey, we should make a space for him in our home. But her obedience to the Lord opened the door for her to have access to a prophet who gave her a word, and then in her time of distress was able to revive her son from the dead, and then came and gave her another word to warn her when famine was coming. So she was able to protect her family, leave for 7 years, survive the famine, and then come back home and recover everything that they had to leave in order to survive the famine. So obedience opens doors. Whenever the Lord asks us to do something, regardless of she could have told, the Lord, why nobody else can't open up their house? He always coming through him. Let's start a meal train where we all just decide to host him whenever he comes, or where we all just make space for him. Or why can't the church just make a room for him since he's always coming here? But her obedience to the Lord and being willing to be hospitable to the man of God opened the door for her to have access to a man who was a conduit of God's power in a way that people probably really hadn't seen since the death of Elisha. Now, people knew that Elisha was Elijah's mentee, but to be able to witness like some of the same miracles, because Elisha had a double portion of Elijah's mantle. But obedience opens doors. And so the Shunammite woman is a great reminder for us to identify our spiritual resources, take great inventory of the people God has put in your life. When you look at biblical context, most kings had a prophet or a priest that was assigned to them, that would be a person who would help them to hear and see and warn and instruct. You want to make sure that you also take a good survey of the root of your faith. How do you respond in times of where it feels like God is taken away, or that there is hardship with the gift that God has given you? Do you like the Shunammite woman? Are you a determined person? Because she said all is well. Her baby is dead, and she still said all is well. Or in times of distress, when something is threatening the very miracle God gave you, do you easily just fall to pieces? And then finally, obedience opens doors. Do you need to know all of the details first before you obey God, or can he just trust you to obey him? And then as a result of your obedience, you'll see the doors be open to you. And those are the lessons that we can learn from the Shunammite woman. Thanks so much for tuning in.